Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&A. These things have been getting a little bit longer as more questions come in, which I'm totally cool with. I have no problem sitting here answering them. But I did want to ask anybody's opinion on this because it is probably going to start to grow a little bit, and I didn't know if people would be annoyed with like 2-hour Q&As a week or something like that. So how do all of you think I should handle this? Just keep going as is? Do I skip over the, the questions that I really don't have any answer to, which is incredibly rude to the person asking, but kind of polite to everybody else's time who's listening? Or do I just kind of pick my favorite questions of the week that are probably the ones that I could answer the best over the rest of them? I don't think I'm at that level yet. I think when I start getting 100 questions a week or something is probably when I would have to move on to that. But I don't, I honestly just want to do whatever you all would like me to do. So as always, please post, wherever your thoughts are on this, and I will try my best to listen. Starting us out, Chris B just RGB modded a 32-inch Trinitron, I'm assuming a consumer-grade Sony, and they're having issues with SNES and Genesis not quite lining up. Genesis seems to be shifted 3 or 4 inches to the right. And it sounds to me like, excuse me, I'm still going to be coughing through this. It sounds to me like that's a sync issue, and you mentioned having a sync stripper in the chain. And this is one of the many reasons why I suggest never using a sync stripper unless you have to, because it won't harm anything if you install it correctly, of course. But you might run into issues like this. So if you have the ability to remove the sync stripper from the setup to see if that fixes it, give it a try. If you have a Genesis that, especially you mentioned it's triple bypass modded, that means the the sync signals are going to be clean. It's going to be 75 ohm sync on the composite line, TTL on the sync line, as it should be, like a real Genesis would be. So you should have a pretty solid sync output. If you're still getting things shifted only on the Trinitron, I am not an expert in RGB modding TVs, but I definitely remember this happening before, and I think Jose said he used Luma as sync instead of composite video, so I ended up losing the S-video input to that TV. I mean, it's switchable, of course, but I think that was his solution then. So I would first try it without a sync stripper, then try seeing if you could tap a different place to insert sync to see if that helps. And the other thing you could do, you mentioned, is there any way to have a cheap per console horizontal shift for sync? Only with external boxes, such as the Extron interface you're probably talking about. There's going to be some other ones available this year that are designed more for consoles. There was that Time Harvest one that's out that seems safe to use, safe-ish. Please refer to the article on RetroRGB about that. So there's going to be more external boxes available, but as long as the console is modded correctly or completely stock, you will never have to worry about sync shift in a normal situation. Only things like a modded consumer-grade TV like you have there. But I think I would definitely start with removing the sync stripper and seeing if that helps, and then trying to tap sync somewhere else in the RGB mod on the TV, and definitely look up forums and stuff where other people have done this to try to get more info. Andrew Neilsley wants to know my experience with VGA Scanline generators and wants to know if there's one I'd recommend. They'd love to have their PlayStation 3 play their PS1 games looking like 240p. At least I think that's what you meant. The only suggestion I have for PlayStation 3 is something I've done before, and that you just use component video output into RetroTINK 2X, OSSE, GBS-Control, or RetroTINK 5X. I think those are the main scalers out there that support scanlines. And they give the exact look that you're probably trying to achieve. I'm not a fan of artificial scanlines because they just blank the horizontal lines. They don't actually recreate the mask of a CRT. But, sometimes referred to as vertical scanlines. It's not really accurate, but it's also not an untrue way to describe it because there are no vertical scanlines. But yeah, I'm probably the worst person to ask about that, only because I could tell you the devices, but I don't really know what would look better because none of them, in my opinion, really look that good. But that's only my stupid opinion. That's not fact. If you like artificial scan lines, awesome. They don't harm anything. They don't add lag. Use whatever your eyes prefer. And as far as the standalone Scanline generators go, because of the cost, unless I'm missing something here, I would almost recommend grabbing a GBS-C instead, just because you could do so much more with it for about the same price, or I guess maybe less if you could mod yourself. And I do know that the HDMI Scanline generators that have been out have gotten pretty bad reviews by people that know what they're talking about. I don't mean to be disrespectful by saying that, but we've all seen the reviews out there where somebody plugs something in and says, "Isn't this wonderful? I plugged it in and it turns on," and they don't actually review what it does. So the people that do actually understand what it does said that they didn't work the way that you would have hoped. So sorry, I can't be too clear on that, but hopefully I could at least point you in the right direction of grabbing an existing scaler and trying those out. Adam Ant wanted to know if the Sinden light gun would ever work with the Mister. Now, I've never used a Sinden light gun. I kept meaning to reach out to Andy Sinden to talk to him about it, and I never had time, and he never reached out to me, as far as I know. I did originally interview Charlie, who I believe that project was all based off of Charlie's open source work, and hopefully, if I'm right about that, hopefully Andy's crediting him for that. But anyway, I don't really have any experience. The only thing I could tell you is that in order to make it work, the Mr. team would have to just add an option for a white border around the screen. I am not a developer, and I do not want to put words in people's mouths, but I think that's a fairly easy thing to do compared to all of the other remarkable work they do. But I think they might be waiting for Andy to add the support to the gun itself if it doesn't already have it. It might simply be that it can register as a USB device and Mr. just needs to add the border, or there might need to be something tweaked. I don't really know, but that's something I would just reach out directly to Andy about. I know he said Mr. support's in the works, but I don't really know if that's happening now. And also, there is another light gun that I'll be covering on RetroRGB soon. Retro Ralph already did a video on it that goes about it completely different. It does not need a border at all. You just put small sensors around your TV, which, depending on your setup, could be amazingly annoying or a better way of going about it. And that should work with Mr. fairly quickly, because I believe that could just be counted as like a USB device or something. And it might even just be able to be used as a USB mouse. I'm just speculating on that, though. I absolutely don't want to talk for the developers. I just wanted to let you know there's another option out there. So the short version of your question, I don't really know, but I would just contact the creator of the Sinden light gun directly and go from there. Lewis F96 wants to know if anyone is actually using the HDL code from the Mr. project to physically reproduce the chips for any of the systems. This would be great for the community to actually build their own consoles and not rely on other companies or even have replacement chips. I think this was Furtek's goal before he developed the Mr. core, and they also saw some NES projects that require the original chips. So, excellent question. I don't know if anything is in the works for that at the moment, but I do hope one of your ideas starts to be done immediately, and that's recreate specific chips that replace certain things in especially arcade boards or other consoles. Now, doing something like the full VDP for a Genesis probably isn't going to be something that people make. They could. I don't know that deep into the level of chip design, but that seems like something where people would just use the cheapest FPGA on the market, load the code into that, and have a chip that's not an actual recreation, but another FPGA. But the other stuff, security chips, lockout chips, stuff like that, I do really hope people start to think about making those, and they should be easier to make than the super complicated ones. So the answer to your question is I don't know if anything's out there already. There could be, and I'm just forgetting. So much info comes through me daily, so I could just be forgetting. But I don't know if they're ever going to do the really fancy chips, but I hope they immediately start taking advantage of the progress that's been made to do the smaller chips. That could be a huge help. I mean, especially stuff like if you have an arcade board that's in fairly good condition, you've restored it all, and you've determined that one chip is the problem, that's not a main processor, that's not made anymore and you can't get them. Yeah, I would absolutely love to see something like that reproduced. Bradley says certain CRTs seem to be the most popular consumer brand, but people often overlook many off-brand options. Has any research been done to determine which are just rebadged units and which are actually low-quality off-brand options? No, I don't know of any. However, I don't think that's as important anymore. Although I do at the same time 100% agree with you in that just because it might not be name brand doesn't mean it's not good. But I think because CRTs have been out of production for so long, none of that matters anymore. I think the only thing that matters is what condition it's in right now today. So please don't misinterpret this as dismissing your question. I just think that the correct answer to your question is to change it a little bit. And just to remind everybody that, if you had what was known as one of the best CRTs ever made 20 years ago and what was known as a mediocre TV 20 years ago, if the mediocre one was barely used and the capacitors are still in good condition and the really good one was used 24/7, the really good one's probably going to look like crap today and the mediocre one's probably going to look amazing. It's probably going to look just as good as it did 20 years ago. So I just want to reiterate what I try to burn into every retro gamer's brains, or even retro TV and movie fan. Any CRT that works and doesn't have major issues is the right answer, period. If you want to go chasing a sharper signal or a bigger tube or anything else, that's cool. That's completely preference-based, and that's awesome as well. But the only right answer is one that works and isn't broken. And the other thing, which is starting to get complicated, just like old cars and everything else that starts to age, you could potentially have a flawless CRT with a tube that's in perfect condition, but the capacitors are all dried out. So do you take the time to go through 100 capacitors, make a cap list, take the time to figure out how to navigate sites like DigiKey, which are not consumer friendly, by the way, and figure out which cap is a good replacement? Replace every single capacitor inside of it after very carefully discharging the CRT so you don't kill yourself on that, and then hope that you ordered the right caps, hope that you did the installation right, fire it up, and hope that was the issue at all. And that's the only downside to this. And the positive side is if you enjoy hobby projects like that, I couldn't think of a better one to do if you're a fan of old analog signals coming from anything. But it does... It is kind of why a lot of people are just throwing their arms up in the air and using flat panels, because you could put a lot of money and a lot of effort into what you think might be awesome, and you fire it up and it's still an old beat up tube that you can't fix because it's the tube itself. So while I do think your question was awesome, I do really think that the right answer is just grab any CRT. Don't even pay attention to the brand. Pay attention to the inputs if that's important to you and the size, but any CRT, try it. If it looks great, that's a winner. If it's the CRT's yellowed, if the glass is cracked or something like that, it's not. Move on and get the next one. DW623 wants to make sure I'm not dead yet. Nope, still kicking. 2 questions though. They bought a Game Boy Advance SP, and the battery doesn't seem to last as long as the other one they have, and they want to know if I have any recommendations for replacement batteries. I have no clue. That's an excellent question. I don't know if they're all just safe to use, if there's something like maybe one of them, one brand is better than the other, one is unsafe or not. I honestly have no idea. Maybe if that's a thing, Macho Nacho Productions would do a video on it. That would be a really cool thing to see. But no, I'm sorry, I got nothing for you. Second question, they just ordered the Shantae Game Boy Color Repro cartridge from Limited Run, and they want to know what to look for excuse me, in the cartridge to make sure it's safe to use. I would very carefully open it up and take the PCB out, and then take out an original Game Boy game and take the PCB out, and make sure the edges look the same. If the new one is a completely flat square and the older one is beveled, so with a slope to it, then I wouldn't put the new one in your Game Boy because that'll slowly wear away at your cartridge slot. You probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference between Enig and hard gold, and I actually don't even think that's nearly as important of an issue because that's really just length of time that the pins last. But, having a cartridge that maybe lasts 50 years instead of 100 is annoying, but it's a way less issue to me than something that could potentially damage your cartridge slot. So that would be number one. And as far as the voltage translations on there, I'm not sure. I would suggest just taking pictures and then heading to a Discord or a forum from people that could really decipher it. I don't even really remember what voltage the Game Boy runs on, so I don't even know if there would be voltage translation issues. But even then, that type of stuff, that stuff doesn't really harm the console. It might lower the life of the cartridge, and it's not good practice, but it's not something I would be really afraid of. That's totally different, by the way, than the original 161-1 carts for the Neo Geo, and especially, like, I think it was the 101 cart for the NES. That's totally different. That's like sending bad voltage down. So I would not worry about like the really bad problems with this at all. I don't think that Limited Run would use somebody that would do that. But yeah, I think my only concern would be, do the edges match original cartridges or not? And that's pretty much it. Earth to Brux says they have a Model 1 Genesis that they modded with Console 5's S-Video kit. The video is great, but they have two issues with it. First, the system has jail bars pretty bad. Most of the jail bar fixes I've seen break composite video, and I don't want lifting a pin to disable S-Video output either. Is there any jail bar fix or improvement that won't break S-Video, or should I just get used to being in the slammer? We're working on something. It's not the highest priority, no disrespect, just because we have a lot of other projects that people have been waiting on us for, but we're definitely working on that. We think we got it done. It's in the testing phase now. I think the only thing that we're waiting on is to build the boards, install them, and go from there. And it might even be something that works on one revision Genesis 1 or not another. So it might be a while before we get documentation out, but I think we're on to something here. So stay tuned, because you're right. The only easy jail bar fix on a Genesis 1 does get rid of composite video. Now, you could do something crazy like do that video fix, undo the S-Video mod from your console, and then use an RGB to S-Video converter, but then you still couldn't use composite video doing it that way. So I would just wait, because if you're going to spend all the time and money doing that, I would wait to see if an easier and much cheaper board would do it for you. Next, also on some areas of densely packed detail, I could see rainbow colors, especially on black and white, like in the test patterns of the 240p test suite. Any ideas what the issue might be or a potential fix? So when you're talking about a console that already has output interference, it could be a lot of things. And even if you could fix it, it might just accentuate the other problems. And that's something we saw on certain Genesis Model 1s, is if you lift the subcarrier, it completely cleans up the image, but now this weird RAM noise that was in the signal is absolutely just overtaking the image. Whereas when you kind of had the jail bars and the other noise, it blended together so you didn't notice it. So then you got to do that fix too. So there's a good chance that even if we sent screenshots in and we figured it out, that when you fixed that, it would accentuate another problem. So I would absolutely just wait for the first fix we're working on, or at the very least then maybe do a triple bypass on it if that doesn't work, and just know that composite video is going to be lost, but good RGB and S video could be had with yet another converter on the outside side of it. So stay tuned. I'll try to get to those within a month or two. Mark Main had a question that I should have known the answer to, because I was a part of the pre-sale. But they just got a used G-SCART switch version 3.2, which I think is the one with the D-sub connector on it. But it didn't come with a power supply. I'm 99% sure it's the same as a Model 1 Sega Genesis. You could check with Super G. Firebrand X said it might be the same as the light one, the G-SCART switch light. But basically, if it's not a USB-based one, I think a Genesis 1 power supply would work. But I would probably just jump on Shmups and ask Super G in the forum just to make sure. Because it's just one of those things that, I would offer to test mine, but I think it's buried in storage somewhere. So if anybody else is listening and wants to confirm, center positive and center negative are really the only things to worry about. Because if the barrel fits or doesn't fit, it doesn't fit. But you want to just get the polarity correct. So if anybody has one and could double check with a cheap multimeter, I think Genesis 1. So I wouldn't just plug it in and try. I would just double check with somebody. Jason Guffey has an original Xbox that is no longer powering it on. It did work fine, and then it just doesn't power on anymore. What do I suggest? Well, I would definitely take it apart and just check that one capacitor. I don't know. I heard the same as you did, that there are a few revisions that don't have the issue, but it's something that you could eyeball. So I would take it apart. And I would take it apart down to the board, meaning pull all of the components out. You don't have to take the board out of the case, and then just visualize the whole thing and see if you see something obvious. Especially as well, reseat everything. So when you're plugging it back in, don't just lift it off and leave it on the side. Unplug and reseat everything, plug it all back in and give it another try. If it still doesn't power on, it could very well be the power supply. It could be the capacitors, but I think I would start with the power supply just because that would make the most sense as to why it just wouldn't power on at all. You could, of course, also probe a few things with a multimeter, but if you're not comfortable with that, I don't blame you. That's a weird thing to get into. So yeah, I would just start with there. Next, they have an OSSC that they want to output to both a CRT VGA monitor and an HDMI 4K TV. So, yep, you're totally safe just using an HDMI splitter. The one that I linked to in my Amazon store seems to work fine for me. I've heard people have issues with it before. The only issue I specifically remember having was with an HDMI to HD SDI converter. That's the only thing I could remember it didn't work with. But I feel like somebody said they had problems as well. So you could potentially have to use other brands, but they're pretty inexpensive. So while I don't ever like to tell somebody to waste money, if you bought one splitter and for whatever reason couldn't return it, at least you have something else that you could probably use on other devices at some other point. And then then just run the other splitter to a VGA output, and that's that. The only thing you have to worry about now, you specifically said you're going to an HDMI 4K TV. So now you're sending your 4K TV a 480p signal if you have them split at the same time. So what might be better for your use, if your goal is actually to either use a VGA monitor or a 4K TV, get a cheap push button HDMI switch, a 1-to-2 or a 2-to-1. I linked to the one I used in the analog DAC testing video I did. It's bidirectional, and that would be something where you press the button and now it's only in VGA mode. So set your OSSC to 480p and you're good. And then when you're ready to use your TV, turn your CRT monitor off, press the button on the HDMI switch, and then set your OSSC to 1080p and you should be done. Lastly, you were talking about the RetroTINK 5X, and I believe you wanted to know a splitter for that as well. I would just wait for my video. I have a ton of different stuff in there. It's long. It's like almost 40 minutes long. So I think while I could probably give some recommendations here, I may have already answered your question in great detail with fancy shots. So I'm certainly not dismissing your question. I just think that, if it's already answered, it's going to be answered way better in that video than I could do just talking about it here. Daniel Adotto said they have about 60 to 70 boxed NES, SNES, and N64 games, plus a few loose carts that they need to sell. They're not getting rid of their consoles or anything with sentimental value, and their friends already took anything they wanted from the collection, and their local game store wouldn't treat them right. They cleaned everything with brass. Oh my God. Oh, don't let Voltar hear that. He'll lose his mind. Do you have any suggestions on selling them quickly without taking a huge loss on the value or avoiding scammers? So, I have to start out by warning and apologizing that I am absolutely biased against eBay because I've had so many nightmare experiences on that. I've been not only have I had people attempt to scam me almost every time I've sold something on there. When I made that video warning people of some of these scams, I had so many comments from people going, "That's not a scam. You're just an asshole who doesn't care about money or something." And I'm like, not only are you wrong, that means you would have fallen for the scam too. So you probably could sell them on eBay, and you probably are going to end up with an absolutely wonderful buyer. I like to consider myself an absolutely drama-free buyer. I buy something, if it arrives and it works, I give positive feedback. If it takes forever for them to ship it, or if there's something a little bit wrong with it, I don't leave any feedback. And I only complain if there's a real actual problem or issue with it. And even then, I don't leave negative feedback or even threaten to unless they're out of their minds, which sometimes you got to just let people know this person's nuts. So eBay could be fine. I think what it sounds like is that you need a reputable game store, or you need to get in touch with reputable collectors. Because the only other thing that I hate to see, which there's nothing wrong with this technically, but I do hate to see those scheming people who see something like, "Oh, that's a special edition. I'll give you $5 for it," and then it goes up on eBay for $1,000 a day later. Like, you need reputable collectors or a good, reliable game store should be able to help with that. You could try eBay. Good luck to you. It's just too much of a nightmare for me anymore. But I think that's it. So I guess what you would need to do is look up place or things in your area. I'm not sure where you're located, nor am I sure if you'd be comfortable with me announcing, yeah, Daniel Lodato lives in New York City by Times Square. So I'll leave that up to you if you want to let that information out there. But I would definitely just try to find other people who have sold or bought collections before, talk to them and see if they can get you some good recommendations. If you got Super Metroid, Zelda: A Link to the Past, or I guess maybe even Mario World boxed, I'd buy those off you just because while I already have those games, it's a weird thing. Some games are my favorites. I just want the whole thing, even though I'm never going to read through the manual again. But that's pretty much it. So, totally understand that sometimes it's a little overwhelming keeping up with collections, but the other option is if you were to just package these up very carefully and leave them in an attic somewhere, you could always come back to them in the future. And who knows, maybe the prices will go up, maybe they'll plummet and they'll be worthless. I don't know. But, it's 100% your personal decision, but out of sight, out of mind is also a good tactic sometimes. So maybe very carefully boxing these up, jamming them in an attic or a basement somewhere. One trick I've been using is I put things in a box and then I bought a gigantic industrial roll of what looks like saran wrap, but it's meant for shipping. And I wrap it in that and then stick it in another box. So if it's ever submerged, it'll still be fine. So I would just consider that as well. Bad Hombre said, on my most recent Roundup episode, I mentioned AM2R being available on Twister OS for the Raspberry Pi. They have family in another country where owning a PC with decent gaming specs is not very common and often prohibitively expensive, and Raspberry Pis and Android phones are the go-to gaming systems. My relatives have expressed interest in playing certain PC exclusives, such as Street Fighter X, Mega Man. So my question is, do you know of a good place to start looking for more similar releases for the Pi, like a forum or Discord server or such? Any help would be greatly appreciated. Honestly, that's an excellent question, and I wish I could be more of a help. I think I would just start going to a place like Twister OS and seeing if they have a Discord server or a forum and asking there. And I think that's an excellent idea. So that's certainly something that might be doable. I guess I would just kind of check with all of that. I know somebody said the other day that somebody had booted the PC version of Mortal Kombat on the 486 Mr. Core or something like that. I thought it was really neat. So excellent question. I'm sorry that I don't have the right answer for that, but I guess I would just start with the Twister OS page and see if they have any other resources for you there. Hopefully the Pi 4 would be powerful enough. But certainly not, I don't think modern games, but maybe with emulation, it might be good enough. Couple of questions from Focus. First, they were wondering if I had any suggestions on what cable to use for building a video cable. No, I've just been, over the years, I've looked up different places to get multi-core coax. It's expensive. It's very hard to work with. So depending on what cable, you might actually benefit from buying a bunch of HD Retrovision cables, cutting the ends off, and direct soldering them. I know it sounds like a waste to do that, but don't forget that the connector ends on the HD Retrovisions are excellent, but what you're paying for is the cable on the inside. So while I hate to waste anything, I guess you could always cut those ends off and save them for a different project. So that might actually be one of the best ways to accomplish it. You could also separate audio. So whatever both sides of your devices are, you could have 3.5 millimeter or RCA jacks for audio. Just buy separate audio cables and go from there. And maybe that actually would be the best move, is make breakout adapters to RCA on both sides and just use HD Retrovision cables and something else and kind of go from there. If you're using RGBS, you could use the HD Retrovisions for RGB and audio and then just grab a single shielded cable for sync, and that's it. But it really just depends on what both ends of your setup look like, how much space you have, how good you are with working with coax cable, because it is not easy at all. Another question, do I have any tips for soldering to the SCART shield? Depending on your setup, you don't always need to ground it. Sometimes, depending on the setup, depending on the device, depending on how many ground planes are run, I think it is a good idea. You might want to just double check on your setup depending. But The only thing I've been able to do is use one of those little clippy things to hold the SCART shield, crank up my soldering gun, and make sure. I just want to reiterate, the shield from the SCART head is out of the cable. It's now just a shield being held up with one of those little things that looks like a robot alien with the pinchers on the end. Holding one of those up, crank up the temperature in the soldering gun, pre-tin the wire. I kind of fan out the wire so it's a little wider than usual. And then I just kind of hold the soldering gun on there until it gets really hot, put some solder on the shield, on the metal shield, and then tap the cable to it, hold it in place. And because everything's so hot, you got to hold it in place for a while until it cools. And then I come back 5 minutes later because it's going to be really hot. But I'm not an expert at soldering. I am good enough to get the job done and not embarrass myself. And that's as far as I'll give myself credit. So you might want to check with other modders about that. But I think that's probably the best bet for your average setups. Chris Brentano said they picked up a physical copy of The Legend of Zelda a few years ago at the Portland Retro Gaming Expo, but when they got home and fired it up, they noticed that some of the letters were missing a pixel. Then, too, that the overworld also had a grid of black pixels over the ground areas. When they first saw this happen, they originally thought maybe it's the battery or something, so I desoldered the old one and put in a replacement holder, but that didn't fix it. I would have done the same thing. That's not the problem, but maybe the battery was causing another problem. That definitely would have been the first step, just because you're going to have to replace that battery at some other point anyway. The next thing I would have done is, are there any basic components on that? A resistor, a capacitor, something. I would have replaced those as well. And remember, when you're checking resistor values, you have to remove the resistor to get its actual value. Or that info could be online as well, depending on the cart. Zelda probably has that info out there. And once again, that's probably not the issue, but we're talking about a 10-cent fix. So after that, I would probably try to reflow the ROM chips on there just to make sure, and physically look for anything like a trace that's gone bad, the old battery leak out and burn through a trace. Depending on your skills, you might remove the ROM, do a really careful job cleaning up the board, making sure there's no leakage or traces that are problems, put the ROM chip back in. But as far as all of that, after you do that, it could very well just be a faulty ROM. So you could try places like NestDev and stuff like that. But generally speaking, I think the tips I gave should be okay. And if I'm wrong, if I'm not thinking straight, please correct me in the comments or something. But I do think the basic way to approach stuff like this is fix the easiest stuff in the world first, even though it's probably not the issue, but it's not going to harm anything. So do that, and then just kind of go step by step afterwards and hope for the best. So hopefully you could repair it without having to have a new ROM chip, and fingers crossed. Logan said they bought a broken Wavebird off of eBay as a donor to replace the worn down sticks on theirs, but when they put theirs back together, it no longer sent a signal, though it's still powered on. I bought another working one with the intention of swapping the sticks, and the exact same thing happened. It powers on but does not send a wireless signal on any channel. Do you have any idea what could be happening? Is this a common issue? So Logan, I've never tried doing this, and I don't know, I'm not an expert at the Wavebird controllers, but when it comes to wireless frequencies, it could be that you need to do something to sync these things up. It could be locked to a frequency, or you could have gotten different production runs. So I guess that's a long way of saying I have no clue, and you're going to probably have to find sources that have done this before. Maybe check the GC Forever forums. So hopefully pointing you there would point you in the right direction, so I'm not totally useless to you, but I got nothing. Sorry. Juan Rodriguez said, this might seem a bit out of left field, but I believe I've heard you mention an issue similar to this in the past. I have an old HDV camcorder and a huge box of DV and HDV tapes they'd like to preserve. The FireWire port on the camera is finicky, so my plan is to capture via HDMI. I have an Atomos Ninja 5 I use when recording for my mirrorless camera. Awesome. However, when I plug the camcorder's HDMI output to the input of the recorder, the camcorder detects it as a DVI device, and the recorder detects that nothing's connected. I've heard you mention the HDMI splitters or extenders that sometimes resolve issues like this where something isn't detected correctly. Do you think it would help, and if so, should I look into it? if your only solution is recording to the Ninja, then try an HDMI splitter. If it sends video but then not audio, that's fine. Then you could just get an HDMI splitter with audio output, which, if you're a nerd like me, you should probably have that in your tool arsenal anyway. So it's a decent thing to invest in. If that doesn't work, as crazy as this sounds, maybe pick up a used SCART to HDMI converter, because it has that HDMI pass-through that does add lag, and it sometimes messes with the signal a little bit. But if it's your camcorder that's just using video, you might not notice a difference, and you should be able to pick those up cheap, because hopefully I've killed the market on those after explaining to people that you should never ever use them with video games. But yeah, that port HDMI in to HDMI out might work. The other thing you could try is any AVR, so like a stereo receiver that has HDMI inputs, or I guess any device, an Xbox, a newer Xbox, any device that has an HDMI in and an HDMI out could help normalize the signal for you. So I would give all of those a try. If you happen to have any DVDO scalers, that would definitely work. I don't think I would recommend buying one just for this. If you were going to drop some extra money, I would just buy a different capture card for your computer. That might be a help that you could then use for other things. But I don't know. I think I may have got you started with tips on where to go in order of cheapest to most expensive. But please let me know how you make out with this, because I'm just kind of curious. Jake Raymond has a few questions about GBS-Control. Assuming horizontal and vertical frequency doesn't change between input and output, does it add any lag converting a 15 kilohertz signal from RGBS to component video? Nope, and I showed that in the video as well with the time sleuth hooked up to it. Does it add any lag converting a 31 kilohertz signal from component to RGB HV? Nope, as long as you're just going from signal, so RGB to component, zero lag. I mean, microseconds, but zero milliseconds of lag, and is the output from the second suitable for a run-of-the-mill VGA compatible CRT. So I guess that would be converting it from component to RGB HV. Yeah, it should, as long as you're just running a 480i signal in via component and you're outputting it via the VGA connector on it, should work perfect. I believe I did that in the video of scaling classic consoles to VGA monitors. And by the way, I'm not saying this as if you should have watched those videos. I don't expect anybody to watch all my crap. I'm just saying that in case you would like more information on either subject, go back to the GBS-Control video and go back to VGA classic consoles on VGA monitors, and the GBS-Control is highlighted in both of those and might give you a bit more detail on the questions that you had. Interesting question from Firebrand X. Say you have a handheld that takes 6 AA batteries. That's a total of 9 volts. Would you compare and contrast how that amperage works from those AA batteries versus a DC adapter hooked into the handheld instead? Can you safely overamp the handheld like you can with home consoles? So I'm 99% sure the answer to that is yes, which means if something requires 9 volts, 0.5 amps, you could send it 9 volt 1 amp, 9 volt 2 amp, 9 volt a million amps, because it will only draw the power that it needs as long as the voltage matches up to spec. So I believe that's why you could do things like take a CDX power adapter and plug that into your Game Gear or Nomad, or plug in your 6 AA batteries. You would want to make sure that you're careful of amperage throughout the whole thing, though, because I believe something like a little 9 volt battery has less of an amperage than a AA, which is why you can't power a Game Gear by 2 9 volt batteries. I think on that one. I'm going off of memory, so whatever. I double checked the amperage thing with a friend of mine who knows more about power than I do. So I'm going to give that like a 99.9% yes on the amperage thing. For the battery, I just wouldn't switch battery types unless you really researched and truly understood exactly what the amperage requirements were and exactly what the battery that you're using is outputting. Alex S. said that they saw the RetroTINK 2X Pro M article, the multi-format one, on the RetroRGB website, where I talked about 720 pass-through being added, but saw that Mike didn't mention it on the main product page. So I would consider that a completely safe feature that I've used since I got the M. It seemed to work fine. If you just need to convert 720p component to HDMI, I would get one of those cheap $20 converters and not worry about it. But if you want to use the other features of that, that's something to think about. Definitely watch the RetroTINK 5X video coming up, because depending on what you want to do, the 5X is a lot better, but you might not need all the features. The M might just be everything that you need, so kind of give that a try. But 720p pass-through should work totally fine. Mike's firmware notes also mentions the 444 sampling is actually pseudo 444. Yeah, that's the oversampling on the outside. That's why it comes out 1440 by 480, not 720 by 480, which allows it to get the full color sampling out of it. I talked about this in the video and a little bit in the post. I know this stuff's confusing, and I don't think I did my best job explaining it, but basically, I would kind of just go through and watch the upcoming 5X video, go back through the Pro-Am stuff and decide which is best. And once again, if you're just converting progressive scan signals, 480p, 720p to HDMI, skip all of it and just get a cheap digital or analog to digital converter. Because it's not that I'm talking bad about the RetroTINK products. I obviously love them, but I just wouldn't want you to see you spend money that you didn't need to spend at all. Also, I'm looking forward to reviewing the Xbox HD Plus scaling features. What's your opinion on integer versus bilinear upscaling for 6th gen consoles? Per game. It all depends on per game, and it also depends on how high you're going. Because if it's 2D graphics, 2D retro style graphics, yeah, integer scale, definitely. But 3D graphics sometimes look amazing if you do something like integer scale 480p to 960p or 1440p, and then let your TV scale that soft to 4K. Sometimes that's actually a really amazing combination. Sometimes it's too sharp, sometimes it's still not as good as you would hope, but my very strong opinion, at least today, my opinions change all the time, is if you have a scaler that you have the ability to change these settings around and you don't mind tinkering, choose per game, because one might look better one way than the other. Do I think the Pixel FX scaler would be better or worse than that? I don't want to comment on anything until it's out, but I also don't think they're competing in that way. I think that that Dan Christoff and now Woozle are making devices based on their own combined technology, and I think Meg Megahertz is just trying to give you awesome features for your Xbox and not trying to dig deep into some craziness. So, with respect to both, I obviously meant both of those as big compliments. So my opinion on this stuff is always the same, is that if you want an HDMI Xbox now, just get the Meg Megahertz one. There's nothing wrong with it. There's not a single thing I found that I didn't like about it. The new features are cool, and as HDMI scalers start to get released for the retro gaming world, it might even be more beneficial to you to run everything in its native original resolution and let the new scaler do the scaling anyway. So I'm not saying don't wait for Dan's. I'm not saying anything other than just kind of giving you the facts. Extremely interested in the RetroTINK 5X Pro. Yeah, video's coming soon. It's super long, but I hope I structured it correctly. It's, opening to tell you why you're here at all, 3 minutes of how to use it for its basic use, and then another 30 minutes of deep dive into the advanced features. I expect most people will only watch the first part, and that's totally fine. It's not fine for YouTube algorithm reasons, but it's totally fine for what I intended it as. Here's what you need to know, and then here's what you should know, and then here's all the advanced features that I really hope you learn about, but if you don't care, it's fine. Lastly, do I think there's any audio performance of the optical audio switcher over a cheap switcher from Amazon? I don't know. I've never really dug into that. As long as it doesn't harm the signal, I don't think there would be any advantage or disadvantage other than the amount of inputs the custom one has. I'm assuming you're talking about the one on Tindy, because I've never seen one on Amazon that has 7 inputs, whereas I know that one does. So it's probably a functionality thing over a quality thing. Oliver Clare said they just pre-ordered a Game Boy Advance consolizer, and they'd like to preserve both the consolizer and their original carts as long as possible, so they were considering getting an EverDrive GBA X5 Mini and just leaving it in the consolizer permanently. Would this EverDrive be the right model for my use case? Yes, but please understand that Game Boy and Game Boy Color support through that cart is emulation. If you want to use Game Boy and Game Boy Color games as well, you would have to buy 2 EverDrives. And to be clear, that's not Crix being funny and making you buy 2 carts. That's a physical limitation of the actual cartridge slot. And the cost of making a cartridge that has some kind of switch to go between the modes would be crazy. You'd have to have some weird kind of mechanical thing in there to reshape the cart. So you'd be stuck with buying both. Also, is it possible to connect 2 controllers to a single consolizer for multiplayer support? No, but you could connect another Game Boy Advance to it like I showed in the original video. So that would be the solution for 2-player. Retro Gaming Boombox wants to know what my recording setup looks like for video streaming. Oh, why'd you do this to me, Retro Gaming Boombox? My streamer friends are going to be so embarrassed that they're friends with me. I ghetto hack everything together for my streams because I don't have a dedicated setup. So all of those live streams are average 2 hours of setup to, unpack an RGB monitor, put it on my table, move my laptop over. Sometimes I remember to run the network cable. Sometimes I forget and stream over Wi-Fi, which in Manhattan is got to be the dumbest thing to possibly do with all the wireless interference. If you're out in the middle of nowhere, especially with newer Wi-Fi, it's totally fine, but always wire something if you can. I'm ashamed to even talk about my setup. However, you said you're looking to streamline a setup so that you could just walk in the room, flip a few switches, and record. I can't answer that because I can tell you what I want to set up if I'm ever able to move to a real people-sized place. And these are tips that I've learned from pro streamers, from fellow nerds, and even through a lot of testing myself. I'd buy a PC, not a laptop. If you're going to do a lot of retro stuff, I would make sure that the capture card you buy is definitely compatible. You could get a used DataPath Vision. You can get that new AverMedia one that supposedly is compatible with all OSSC modes and everything else. I would set up personally a streaming corner, not a gaming corner. So I would have inputs into my RGB monitor. And then I would have the outputs of that monitor because the BNC has in and outs in the back of it. The outputs would be going into the input of probably the RetroTINK 5X, and then that would be run into the capture card. And on the input side, I would probably have either a receptacle SCART port or something there so that I could either plug SCART directly in or I could use the component video converter to SCART. It's not a signal converter. I mean, just like a pass-through converter. Actually, I think I have one here. Yeah, so if I needed to do component, I could just plug this in and then flip the switch on my PVM for component. There's also a VGA adapter coming out that looks just like that could do sync combining. I would use my 20L5 because it accepts all signals. So that way, anytime I wanted to stream, oh, and of course, keyboard, mouse, monitor, network cable, all that stuff. But anytime I wanted to stream, my new setup would be walk over with the console that I want to play, plug it in, turn on my monitor, set the monitor to, component or RGB, or I guess I could do, I could have cables for composite and S-video connected and dangling on input and output side as well, which is nice. And then I would set the RetroTINK 5X to its input. I'd realize that on the output side, I would have to probably switch inputs depending on whatever it is that I was using, and that's it. So OBS would always be set up on that PC. A dedicated PC for streaming 1080p does not need to be an expensive PC at all, especially if you're streaming retro. If you're streaming on the PC, obviously that's totally different. But if the entire purpose of the PC is to accept signals from the RetroTINK 5X or OSSC or any other scaler, and then go out from there, you could get a cheap PC for $200 that could do this. And I would have everything all set up so that day one setup would probably be 2 or 3 hours of adjusting the webcam, getting the lighting, getting, positioning the cheap, crappy monitor that I had hooked up to the PC. But essentially, it would just be that I would build a station that you drop your console in, you plug in the input side, set your monitor, set up the cables for the output sides if you need to switch inputs on your scaler, and that's it. So that's my dream, to have a mini streaming section like that. And I guess that would even work if I was gaming on my laptop. My laptop is actually pretty powerful. So if I were doing that, I could just take the HDMI output of the laptop, go into the other PC, and still have a dedicated setup. So I could play PC games as well. And still play, I'd play it right on the laptop screen, which is decent. It's a 144 hertz screen, but I'd still have the keyboard, mouse, and other monitor for the chat and stuff like that. Other than that, the only other thing is you could do the exact same thing, but set up the station in the corner of the same room that your full setup's at, and then use a G-SCART switch or G-Comp switch to go one into your RGB monitor, the other one into your streaming setup, and that's it. So yeah, my setup now is pretty embarrassing, and it's just the most inefficient thing that I could possibly do, but it's what I have to do. I could stand and play, and I like standing to make these videos, and I like standing and working, but standing while trying to play a video game, work the chat, think about what I'm saying, trying to be entertaining, I don't think I could pull off all of that at the same time and have the same experience. Maybe I should try, though. Who knows? Maybe I'll do the next one exactly as you see here and see how it goes, and maybe I'll buy a stool too. Who knows? But yeah, hopefully I could point you in the right direction with that tips. And by the way, feel free to make fun of me for my horrible streaming setup. I need to do better. 2 questions from Kieran O'Donnell. The first is recommendations for converting component video to VGA for use on VGA CRTs. And the second is, how does playing something like an original Xbox compare on a PC CRT to something like a multi-format PVM? So I have a strong opinion about the second one. I think using GameCube, Xbox, Dreamcast, and depending on the game, even the Wii, look amazing on a VGA monitor. Honestly, if you could just find any one, even if the case is all beat to crap, if you turn on the monitor and the screen isn't all yellowed and blurry and crappy, it would look amazing. And I don't think it would justify the price of going to a multi-format. I have a 20L5 because it's the easiest thing in the world to me to have one monitor that I could do everything on in this tiny apartment. But if I didn't own any monitors and I was going to look, I would go pick up a big VGA monitor from someplace. I'd try to find one free laying on the side of the road, or metaphorically, like through friends, whatever else. And I would also pick up any PVM, and I would be all set with both of those. I'd have 2 setups, one for 480p, one for 15 kilohertz. So yeah, I absolutely think it's worth going down this road if you could find a free or near free VGA CRT. As far as conversion, if you don't ever need any extra features, I believe LinuxBot 3000 on eBay sells them. It's a perfect example of when I say stay away from crappy eBay sellers. Not everybody on eBay is terrible. LinuxBot 3000 is great. The other side of that too, if you need any extra features, especially if you could do it yourself, GBS-Control is awesome. I know I say this all the time, but if you're a retro gaming tinkerer, not somebody who just wants to play their games and not worry, but if you like to tinker, make a GBS-C, mess around with it, spend a day just learning how it works. Spend time making it not work and then figure out how to get your settings back. And then you could just leave it in output mode, so it doesn't convert or it doesn't scale anything. It would take component in, spit VGA out, and that's it. And then if you ever need it for anything else, you could pull that out of your setup and go use it for other stuff. So short answer to that, try to look for somebody in the retro gaming scene who makes those. LinuxBot 3000 is a good person to check with for just a basic converter. But if you want something that's fully featured, plus can do that, definitely GBS-Control. Well, that's it for this week. If you're still with me after that last weird section, sorry. I always like to keep things positive, and I'm so grateful that I get to work with and interact with so many amazing people from all around the world. I every single day, I definitely recognize how lucky I am to get to do this. So when something negative comes along that needs to be addressed, it sucks because I want to be happy. I want to be like a jolly fat drunk Santa. I don't ever want to be a depressing person or somebody that takes the wind out of your sails. So hopefully you'll forgive me in the times that I feel necessary to address the other stuff. And I try to do it in as drama-free a way as possible. I don't always succeed, but I'm only human. And as always, thank you to everybody that participates in these, and especially thank you to everybody who supports in any way possible, because it's really you that's keeping all of this stuff alive. So thank you all so much, and I'll see you next week.